I don't think they found her yet.
Everybody. And they're all right with me, and I'm looking for a leader. And they just sit there. Yes.
Hello? Is that on? There you go. Hello, welcome to our last speaker series of 2024. Thank you for coming out. We do have a special speaker series next month with Tony DeGarolamo. Excuse me for my pronunciation. That one will be a fundraising event for archival material. So more information on that is on our website. Today, Dr. Wendy Woloson will be speaking to us. She is a professor of history at Rutgers University-Camden and the author most recently of, well, now of Crap, A History of Cheap Stuff in America, but her other books are In Hock, Pawning in America from Independence Through the Great Depression, also by the University of Chicago Press, and co-editor of the collection Capitalism by Gaslight, Illuminating the Economy of the 19th Century in America. Thank you for coming to speak.
Thank you for having me. I suppose you want me to speak into this device here. Okay. Thank you for coming and sharing your lovely day with me. And thank you, Brittany, for inviting me. My printer's on the fritz, so I'm going to have to read from my laptop, which is slightly asocial. So I apologize for that. So I'm really happy to be here and talk to you a little bit about material from my fairly new book, Crap, History of Cheap Stuff. You can go to the next slide. And in that book, I talk about a lot of different kinds of crap, including gadgets and free giveaways and novelty goods and other things. But today, I'm going to talk to you about mass-produced collectibles and how we create ideas of value. And a little disclaimer, I always like to say at the start, like if you recognize yourself in some of these slides or some of the stuff, I'm not trying to be judgmental. So when I'm talking about mass-produced collectibles or any other kinds of what I'm calling crappy things, I'm just trying to understand these things. Everybody has sort of a personal relationship to their things. So if you collect these kinds of things, like, good for you, that's fine. But today I want to just talk about how we create value from these things. So we usually don't question the sort of worthwhileness of things like Fabergé eggs and Chippendale chairs, paintings of modern masters. These things are old, they're beautiful, they have some kind of integrity, in association with the past. And collecting these things is considered a valid activity, right? Especially since we have shows like Antiques Roadshow, American Pickers, and things like that, which just sort of, kind of justify and reinforce the activity of collecting, right? But one category of goods that you don't see on American Pickers or Roadshow is mass-produced collectibles, intentional or what I call born collectibles, things that were reproduced especially to be collected. Their provenance, where they came from, can't really be traced through the lineages of great families, but they come from factories in Asia. They emerge from lines of automated production rather than from small workshops and hand craftsmanship. They're made often of inferior or imitation materials. And so we really can't see anything fine or praiseworthy about the stuff they're made from. And they're created today, so they lack what I call the sincerity of older objects. But despite all these things, born collectibles have enjoyed a lot of popularity and have really become popular collectibles, and to me raise intriguing issues about the nature of value itself. And here's just some more, sorry, Brittany, could you go to the next slide? Yeah. So here's some examples of the stuff that I'm talking about. So it brings up these questions of value, like how contingent value can be, how arbitrary it can be, how conflicting spheres of value often sort of are possessed in objects simultaneously, and how intensely we can value these things, even if in the end they don't really deserve such devotion. So I'm going to unpack all of those things. I know that's a little jargony, so I'm gonna go through it and tell you what I mean. So can we go to the next slide? So on the most basic level, these intentional collectibles have accrued value simply because we call them collectible. We sort of set them apart as a different, separate category of object. And while there was a widespread collecting mania that started in the 19th century with collectible spoons, it wasn't really until the mid-20th century that companies really dedicated themselves to producing nothing but these mass-produced collectibles. So traditional collecting takes time, effort, resources, and money, and research too. And while newer collectors in the post-World War II era certainly wanted the benefits of having a collection, something to brag about, a hobby, something to kind of help forge their identity, nice things to put in their home, they didn't necessarily have the time or the patience for going to flea markets. This was in the days before eBay, so amassing things took time, and it took a different kind of effort than is required today. So this created an opportunity, a new opportunity for companies to kind of seize on making these intentional collectibles and removing the barriers of entry, making cheaper things that were easier to kind of get your hands on. So they both stoked a collecting impulse among post-war consumers. So they created this sort of desire, and then they obliged that desire by creating the stuff that could suit people's purposes. So to pull this off, producers simultaneously accentuated and erased key aspects of the born collectible status as a commodity. And by that, I mean something that is made just for the market to be bought and sold. So manufacturers had to mass produce these things as cheaply as possible to make them, attractive and accessible. They had to produce them in quantities large enough to maximize economies of scale. And at the same time, they had to convince potential consumers or collectors that these objects possess the qualities that collectors of higher end pieces traditionally valued, such as distinctiveness, rarity, aesthetic worth, sound workmanship, investment value, and so on. And for their part, collectors, these post-war collectors, found that they liked the certainty of born collectibles, knowing that they could reliably purchase new issues of these things. And they didn't have to go hunting around flea markets, go to, high-end auctions or things like that. So because of that, these objects have and had in what I call inherent contradictions. They made claims to the past, but all the while they were produced in the here and now. People had to believe in the material quality and superior workmanship of their collectibles. At the same time, they wanted to enjoy collectibles relatively cheap prices, affordability, and the fact that they were mass produced. They had to see their collections as expressions of self, because we collect not only because we enjoy it, but because we see our collections as extensions of ourselves. So they wanted to see that too, all while knowing that these constituent parts were far from unique. So to reconcile all of these contradictions, purveyors of born collectibles, the people making and selling these things, used a bunch of different strategies. And if we can go to the next slide, to leverage these different things that I've just talked about. And here is an early ad for one of the earliest mass-produced collectibles from the 20th century. And I apologize for the quality of the image, but this is the actual, how the original appeared in what was called Hobbies magazine. And this is an ad, as you can see, for this collectible plate, the plate that took the blue ribbon. And you can see that they've taken like a vaunted and well understood image. It's hard to tell, but this is the Last Supper that's on this collectible plate. And they've also given you points of like material quality. It has a lacy border. It's rendered in 23 karat gold. There's a sense of scarcity, a first edition, and there's a credentialing and a kind of validation by a seemingly reputable outside source. In this case, the plate having won the blue ribbon at the 1949 Indiana State Fair, which, like, I guess that sounds impressive. Yeah, like, sure. So, you know, these things are sort of meant to appeal to people. So next slide, please. Following soon after the appearance of this plate on the market were Hummel figurines. Anybody are familiar with Hummels? Do they seem familiar? Okay. All right. When I talk to younger audiences, they have no idea what I'm talking about, but they were superly popular when I was growing up. Which says more about me than them. Following soon after the appearance of that collectible plate on the market were Hummel figurines, what we might consider to be the epitome of modern collectibles and sort of the thing that like created the template for companies, as we'll see, that came after this. They started to become popular in World War II. Soldiers brought them back from Germany as souvenirs. And by the 1960s and 1970s, they had become incredibly popular. They also featured highly accessible subject matter and had a sanctified origin story and offered expansive and easy collecting opportunities. So Hummels were three-dimensional ceramic versions of the drawings of and paintings of Sister Berta Hummel, Sister Innocentia. Here, that's a picture of her. This is one of her drawings. She was a formally trained artist, and in the 1930s, a formally trained artist who became a nun. And in the 1930s, German ceramics manufacturer Franz Goebel approached her about the prospect of turning these drawings into ceramic figurines, and they started production in 1935. They became so popular and so quickly that they saved Goebel's floundering business during the war from bankruptcy. So it might at first seem surprising that these figures would find such traction in the post-war consumer market. If you think about other things that people were buying, like, you know, cars with like chrome plated fenders and newfangled appliances and turquoise and, you know, all of that sort of the Jetsons kind of aesthetic. It seems like these things, it's hard to make sense of these things. But many were immediately captivated by the figurine's sort of safe and understandable subjects. So here we go, Brittany. Children singing, children carrying umbrellas, children huddled under umbrellas, children holding baskets, children sitting on fences holding baskets, children holding baskets with chicks, children with ducks, children with dogs, children with fawns, children with rabbits, children with chickens. Like what was going on here? So new suburban Americans had increasing space in their houses and increasing disposable income to buy this stuff. But why these things? They're so kind of weird. But people enjoyed the nostalgia of these things, seeing these figurines sort of anchored in the past, and anchored not even in an American past, but in a German past, and not even like the recent past of Germany, but like a distant past. They're wearing like Tyrolean lederhosen and Tyrolean hats, you know, you can see. And so despite their sort of like backward looking focus, people love them, or probably because of that. So Goebel and his retailers made collecting as easy and as unchallenging as possible, issuing series of related figures that collectors could understand sort of mentally and obtain them physically. If we can look at the next slide. And you can see they produced a lot of printed literature that helped collectors along. So you can see somebody who owned this booklet sort of X'd off each of those figurines as it was probably her, collected them. And that was intentional. You know, Goebbels wanted to make acquisition, getting these things as easy as possible. If we can go to the next slide. A sense of collectors' own status and discrimination and distinctiveness was reinforced by the establishment of the MI Hummel Club in 1977. Members received a quarterly newsletter, a little ceramic plaque for belonging, handsome binders with a collector's log and price list. You know, again, this is to help them keep track of their purchases and encourage them to purchase more, while also creating this sense of sociability that, like, I'm doing this along with other people. This is a shared hobby. Like other aspects of Born Collectibles, the Hummel Club was at once a marketing boon and a community builder. So these local clubs forged bonds among like-minded people who enjoyed a shared interest. Next slide, please. And this, of course, encouraged people to purchase more of the same thing. For example, people who got together could compare their Hummel figurines with each other and look for variations. These might be production variations, just sort of differences in how they were painted or the colors. And sometimes they were intentional, produced by the company itself. And so part of this was not just collecting one figurine that you liked, but collecting several of the same model because you saw these variations. And that happened a lot more if you had other people who you could sort of compare your figurines with. So if we can go to the next slide. So what came after Hummel's were Precious Moments figurines. Everybody know, some people know Precious Moments. You might even have some in your own homes. Okay, so remember my disclaimer, not making judgments, just trying to understand these things. So Precious Moments worked in the same way that Hummel's did. Created in the late 1970s by lay minister and missionary Sam Butcher, their subjects were also overtly religious, sort of like the Hummel figurines. Hummels were like often advertised as being directly associated with Sister Innocentia, you know, so like you felt like these things had a kind of almost religious purpose too. Similar to Precious Moments, Butcher himself said, quote, "I believe that God used Precious Moments subjects to open the door of Christian service whereby we could enter and touch the lives of many." And like, how could you argue with that? That's a hard thing to, you know, argue with. And it seems like fine. And it gives another impetus to collect these things. And if we can go to the next slide. Here's just an example from the Precious Moments website. You can see a lot of the same things, that these are limited editions. They're promoted as special, unique objects, even though they're mass produced and they're easy to buy. A dedicated publication, Precious Moments Insights, reached some 10,000 collectors. There were special events for club members. And through the Precious Moments Club, boasting nearly 1 million members by the mid-1990s, a lot, collectors would receive special benefits. And Precious Moments wasn't alone in creating this sense of community among collectors. The late 1970s through the 1990s was really was really the heyday of collecting clubs. And if we can go to the next slide, you can see this list of all of the many. Seems like half of that's not showing up, but that's okay. Imagine the slide completely filled up with names of different clubs and societies. People came to value their collections as special and unique, even though they were also well aware that their objects were mass produced. If we can go to the next slide, you can see they're produced by the tens of thousands in overseas factories. So Born Collectibles like these and others proved to be cash cows for manufacturers, distributors, and retailers who served as sort of the conduits, carefully negotiating this commodity collectible threshold. They're treating them as commodities. I need to sell this thing to you, but I don't want you to see it that way. I want you to see it as something else, something you bring into your home, something you care about, something that helps to like build your personal identity. And maybe it's a part of a status, you know, like it's part of a larger collection and you feel like a pride in that. So as one newspaper noted at the time, Inesco, the producer of Precious Moments, quote, has made a bundle selling these things. Ingeniously, the company periodically retired figurines in order to create a sense of scarcity. And this not only boosted sales on the primary market, but also drove demand on the secondary market. And it's important to remember that with these things, you need the secondary market, meaning the resale, the used goods market, to keep people buying the primary things because they know that they can sell them. And there's demand beyond just the retail sales of these things. And if we can go to the next slide, and as this testimonial suggests, collectors imbued these things with emotional import, religiosity, and they felt connected to these things. So if you suggested that they were cheaply made or not really unique, you were suggesting that their message was somehow, suspect as well. And you might even be making a comment on me. I love these things. And what are you talking about? So it was really difficult for many collectors to kind of disentangle the material realities of these things from their sentimental feelings. So if we can go to the next slide. So women were the most frequent collectors of these figurines, Hummel's precious moments, but men were riding the born collectibles wave too, following sort of what we know about gendered collecting patterns. So men tended to buy more commemorative objects. And one such commemorative enterprise was the Franklin Mint, founded in 1964. They also used savvy marketing to create demand, but took kind of a different strategy. They drew on the mainstream numismatic world to invent value in the case of coins and medals. And they channeled sort of romantic and heroic histories in the case of their replica models to get people to become interested in them. And here are a couple of examples from their advertising. To sell the gold and silver dollars, for instance, they hired a former chief engraver for the US Mint, thereby attaching like a well-known kind of, well-respected name to its coins. From the very start, they also touted the alloys of their products as something better and proprietary, something you couldn't get anywhere else. Things made of Nikon, they called it, sterling plus, Franklinium. Like, what are these things? These things sounded special and exclusive and valuable. By the early 1970s, the Franklin Mint was drawing more and more people into its collecting orbit, attracting most especially newcomers willing to place their faith in the company's marketing efforts, which flattered their collectors as members of an elite cohort. We're marketing these things only to you because you know and you can understand and appreciate these things, unlike other people. So commemorative metals and old coins appealed to collectors' desire to connect to a certain vaunted aspect of American history. They emphasized to people that they could own a piece of the past. And this promotional literature emphasized intellectual curiosity, allowing collectors to envision themselves not as like crass materialists, people who only cared about money, but more serious and educated thinkers interested in history over money. So for example, if we can go to the next slide, please. The selling script for the Franklin Mint's Carson City coins prompted sales agents to say to potential customers, and I'll read some of this in case it's too small, but let me just explain it, that these sheets were put in front of their operators who would call people who had already made purchases with Franklin Mint and try to sell them something new. And so they were given both the price list and scripts to use. So this one says, imagine holding in your hand a rare and valuable piece of American history, an heirloom. So think about the words that they're using because they're using them for a reason. An heirloom minted in solid gold dating from 1870 to 1893. Sound impossible? However, you can actually own a genuine Wild West $20 double eagle gold piece containing nearly an ounce of gold. These are authentic US Mint gold coins struck at Carson City and steeped in the rich history of the Western frontier. I'll take all you have. That sounds great, right? If we can go to the next slide, we can see another example of this. Marketing efforts also appealed to collectors' sense of their own discrimination and connoisseurship, using essentially meaningless superlatives that nevertheless elevated these collectibles in the minds of the buyers. So these were words that sounded great, but really actually were, worth nothing. They meant nothing. So for example, the Indian head gold pieces were widely believed to be the most beautiful coin ever designed and struck by the US Mint. Well, that's great, but that's subjective. And how does beauty, you might like to look at this thing, but there's a suggestion that that beauty sort of converts into some sort of like monetary value. Their limited supply was being offered only to clients like you. So there's a sense of rarity and exclusivity. The US silver dollar eagle coin was the largest, heaviest, and purest of all silver coins. The US state quarter set represented the highest level of the minter's art, very rare, only produced in very low quantities. So the Franklin Mint constructed value in these ways and in other ways as well, using artificial credentialing that borrowed from the parallel world of antiques and art collecting. So many coins were encapsulated in clear plastic packages, secured with fancy seals, and came with official documentation and were expertly graded, which is what happens with the collectible coin world. But these things were authenticated and graded within the Franklin Mint itself, not by outside independent experts. If we can go to the next slide, you can see that some of their authenticating strategy was to produce these certificates of authenticity. What was being authenticated, though? And Franklin Mint, again, was producing its own certificates. So it was like this internal feedback loop. So from the coins, the Franklin Mint began venturing into other collectibles categories as well. They became well-known makers of commemorative dolls and plates, Jackie Onassis, Marilyn Monroe, Princess Di, again, really familiar, sort of vaunted figures from our past. Other companies supplying the born collectibles market, and there were many, used similar strategies to generate interest in collecting in general and into their products in particular. Dedicated publications, if we can go to the next slide, also encouraged and validated the activities of collectors. Columns consistently sort of put together the collectibles investment and entertainment value. So one example is Rarities magazine. Think about that title, Rarities magazine. Owning collectible objects, this is a quote from them, is owning a part of history. From an economic approach, it can also mean owning a larger part of the future. The quote continued, our basic criteria for any area of collecting will be asked, is it fun? And equally important, can it be considered as a legitimate investment? They're talking here about these mass-produced collectibles. Okay, so the Bradford Exchange, if we can go to the next slide here. Purveyor of china plates and other commemorative objects, launched one of the boldest efforts to establish their products as verified and authentic. The company invented something called the Market Braddox, which tracked the aftermarket for collectible plates and was considered among collectors to be the Dow Jones of plate collecting. It was described at the time in the early 1980s as, quote, $500,000 commodities trading floor installed behind glass walls and featuring state-of-the-art computer equipment. So you can see it here. This helped collectors believe that things were true investments that they bought from the Bradford Exchange and could be understood in terms of high finance. Some plates were mainstays on the exchange, while others were volatile and could cause excitement and perform well or poorly. Collectibles Illustrated published a cover story on, quote, the Great Plate Explosion. I think we have that on the next slide. Thank you. In 1983, featuring a woman who exclaimed, in 1976, I bought this plate for $45. It has since appreciated 600%. So you can see they're using the same logic and language of investment strategies to talk about collectible plates. Because of all of these self-reinforcing efforts, the collectors clubs, the price guides, magazines, the slick marketing, the Braddox, the born collectibles market was then especially primed, if we can go to the next slide, for the introduction of Ty Inc.'s Beanie Babies in 1993. And you must all know Beanie Babies, right? Depending on one's perspective, Ty either brilliantly capitalized on or cynically exploited, or maybe both, the forces that had been driving the market in born collectibles for almost 2 decades. By 1995, Ty Inc. began to turn these understuffed beanbag plush toys into serious collectibles. The company created, again, a sense of scarcity by limiting the production of each new design, but without telling collectors that limited productions might still mean examples produced in the tens of thousands and shipped from China and Korea literally by the plane load. Ty also only sold the toys through select retailers and limited the number of designs each store would receive. And if you collected Beanie Babies, you remember this. You had to go to certain stores, and you had to go to a bunch of different stores if you wanted, to fill in your collection. The company also regularly launched and retired designs. Rumors about scarcity drove up demand, and figures' retirements acted as good publicity. And this approach was wildly successful. In 1998, the company's net profits were some $7 million, more than its 2 key competitors, Hasbro and Mattel combined. And at one time, the sale of Beanie Babies accounted for 10% of all sales on eBay. Ty successfully created a massive collecting craze around what was really actually a fairly crappy product. It wasn't even like a fully stuffed toy. Collectors bought up all the toys they could from retail outlets and at McDonald's, where they came in Happy Meals. And I remember the newspaper reports and the television reports of like adults lining up at the drive-through of McDonald's to buy all the Happy Meals they could. And eventually they said, no, only kids can buy these. But, and they were throwing out the food and just keeping the Beanie Babies. It was crazy. But the point is, people thought that these things had real value and that they had to get them. If we can go to the next slide, they often encased with their pristine heart-shaped tags in specially designed clear plastic boxes up here and tag protectors. They examined the toys for the minutest differences. Those with production errors, which we would think would be even crappier, became more valuable because they were considered rare. And special issue pieces such as the Princess Diana bear, I don't know if you all remember that, was a big deal, were especially prized and sold at one time for thousands of dollars. By the late 1990s, there was a burgeoning black market in Beanie Babies, insurance scams involving Beanie Babies. Next slide, please. At least one divorcing couple, reluctant to part with any of their prized possessions, were forced by the judge to sit on the floor and pick them out one by one. Yes, so this is the divorce proceedings where they were able to divide up all their other possessions, but they would not budge on the Beanie Babies. And so this is what they came to. They're groveling on the floor for their little floppy plush toys. Regardless of what people collected, collecting gave countless members of society real social benefits from their hobby. Next slide. And here we can see that from these obituaries. Gave them a sense of identity, gave them a sense of community, and a connection to powerful memory objects. Okay, but here's the more kind of sinister thing. Many collectors were also literally banking on the investment potential of these mass-produced collectibles. In this, collectors were trying to emulate how the elite established not only cultural capital, but financial capital through the collecting practice. For example, an article from the late 1980s noted that Hummels weren't just cute objects, but big bucks that could command as much as $20,000. Serious collectors were paying premiums to scouts who would locate hard-to-find pieces. And in a little over a decade, one woman spent upwards of $50,000 on Precious Moments figurines. So, there's a thought, not just that these things are giving me personal pleasure, but I'm going to be able to capitalize on these things. Another woman's husband purpose-built an extension in their house, her own little museum, shaped like a chapel, to house her 1,000 Precious Moments figurines. Yet another woman spent so much money on Precious Moments figurines that she bankrupted her family and allegedly murdered her husband when he found out. But eventually the bubble burst for these newly mass-produced collectibles. And here's perhaps one of my favorite listings from eBay ever. An article from 2003 declared Beanie Babies to be, quote, past their prime, prices having plummeted. They were auctioned off for charity. US soldiers were taking them over to Iraq and giving them to children. So like we can't even, like we're shipping them over, we're trying to get rid of them in any way we can. Other mass-produced collectibles suffered the same fate. By the 1990s, the industry as a whole was, quote, sailing in troubled waters. Stock in the collectibles companies themselves was at an all-time low. And industry experts saw no anticipation of growth at all. Next slide, please. To many people, born collectibles had become a joke. And this is from this satirical website, The Onion, making fun of collectible plates. So there were many reasons for this. One was the growing popularity of eBay and other online sites, which replaced what we call information asymmetries in the market. So now it was really easy for anybody to see how many of these things were out there and what their going price was, which wasn't possible before. Changing demographic factors affected the market as well. So as collectors got older, they started to divest their collections. Younger people weren't so interested in collecting these things as well. And so there were fewer people willing to buy both the retail and the resale. So remember when I was talking about the secondary markets, there's nobody there interested in like how many people have bags of Beanie Babies in their closets or their parents did. Like I know when I was cleaning up my mother's house after her death, I found a huge bag of Beanie Babies. I think that was like for a certain generation, that was pretty normal. So collectors and their descendants came face to face with these contradictions when these collections had to be liquidated, where the sentimental and the collectible value met the hard market, the hard economic market. And the personal accounts were often quite tragic. Even in the face of often dire warnings from antiques and collectibles experts, people were that these things would not have economic value. People were still seduced by the idea that they did. So when it came to Beanie Babies, one collecting expert argued that the pellet-filled toys would not withstand the test of time necessary to create true collectibles. Dedicated collectors, however, continued to place their trust in founder Ty Warner, seeing him not as a leader of a multi-million-dollar toy company, but almost like Sister Berta Hummel as a benevolent source of the stuff that made possible their collecting hobby. You know, so again, erasing the sense that these are commodities. He's not the multi-million-dollar owner of this company. He's like a benefactor who's supplying these things that make me so happy. One person said, I think, quote, I think that we have a whole group of baby boomers that love beanies. There was a statement Ty made. He said, I'm in it for the longevity. I really believe that everything Ty does is based on that statement. So she's operating on faith. As to collectors' insistence that they bought out of pure pleasure, one antiques expert responded, quote, you want to prove? You want a Beanie Baby for fun? Take the scissors and cut those tags off. Hug them. Take them to bed with you. Play with them. That's fine with me. I don't have a problem with that. When you stick them on the shelf and bow down and worship them, you've got a reality check problem. But these collectors were only ever trading in a sort of parallel universe that was fundamentally unreal, operated on faith, and that was modeled on but would never quite intersect with the high-end world of collecting. A false sense of expertise and connoisseurship was nurtured by companies who encouraged collectors to seek knowledge about their hobby through the information that they themselves put out. So this nearly non-existent market must have come to as a shock to collectors who spent decades amassing these things for enjoyment and investment. And if we can go to the next slide, this is one of the saddest stories that I have to tell. This was especially true for collectors of commemorative coins, who might understandably and logically conclude that their collections had robust resale value, given that they were money or perceived to be like currency. One story among many was this one from DA from Troy, Michigan, who wrote to financial expert Malcolm Burko in 2012, inquiring about the value of his collection of coins from the Franklin Mint. And his letter bears looking at in its entirety. And so he says, during the past 25 years, I purchased over $47,000 in collectible silver coins and beautiful non-silver coins from the Franklin Mint for my retirement, because I thought the scarcity and limited edition minting of these coins would drive up their value over the years, and because I believed their silver content in the silver coins would also increase in value. Remember those sales sheets that I showed you? That's where he's getting these ideas from, because that's what he's been told by the people from the Franklin Mint who were selling these things to him. So he takes the coins to a coin dealer who offers him $2,500 for the whole lot. He's devastated because when he was buying all those coins, he thought because they were minted in limited production, they would have a future value. He says, he concludes, I'd be happy to get at least half of what I paid for them if possible. And by the way, can I sue the Franklin Mint for this? Burko says, no, you can't. And, you know, this was unfortunately the situation that this collector found himself in. He had overpaid by orders of magnitude for the collectible coins. He wrote, this is Malcolm Burko, the expert, says to this man, the coin advertisements are always carefully prepared with clever buzzwords designed to infer great value and urgency, but grossly misleading to most readers who lack the knowledge to make an intelligent buying decision. Even truly collectible silver and gold coins sold far above prevailing retail markets and prices. The other thing was that the coins that the Franklin Mint sold that had the special, either the special metals or the special sort of finishes, were themselves what the US government would call defacements of coins. So even if it was a quarter that had a special, you know, like limited edition surface to it, you would have to take that surface off in order to like resell that coin. And so these things were, the US Mint said, essentially ruined pieces of currency. You would have to put more effort into making these things real quarters again than they were worth. People encountered the same bad news with commemorative plates, collectible figurines, Beanie Babies, and most other born collectibles. And you can see that if you go to any like antique mall, flea market, you can see these things still on the market, trying to be sold on the secondary market. Enesco, the company making Precious Moments figurines, stopped making them in 1908. Goebel closed its Hummel factory in 2008. Enesco stopped making Precious Moments, and Goebel also closed its Hummel factory. So those are, you know, examples of how this market is really contracting. So as much as the collectors themselves, and maybe we can go to the final couple of slides here. So as much as collectors themselves, companies trafficking in born collectibles also came to realize that value was highly contingent, and that the companies relied on this desirability among collectors to keep their businesses afloat, which happened for a few decades. And then when those markets dried up, the companies could no longer be successful either. And so in this way, the collectibles market actually did intersect with more high-end markets. Those two would continue to be socially constructed and performative marketplaces whose values were also established and supported by many of the same things, such as a care for provenance, again, where something came from, its history, authenticity, uniqueness, rarity, material quality, and so on. And so born collectibles were and are mass-produced commodities simply created to be marketed as things to be collected. Everything about them, except their ability to evoke personal sentiment, which, you know, people did get very attached to these things, had to be constructed out of, puffed rhetoric, inferior materials, and bogus stamps of authenticity. With very few exceptions, they could only ever be these sort of false things, true only in what collectors sort of put into them. So in other words, like their value could only ever be sentimental, which is fine. The problem is when companies also market it at the same time, the idea that they will increase in value and they're also good investments, that's when, to me, they become crappy. And if we can go to the final slide here, I'll wrap it up. While born collectibles are still being produced, their heyday is over. Newer generations prefer virtual to material worlds. Their tastes reside in the future rather than the past. But for a long while, drawing from collecting habits begun in the mid-19th century and really gaining ground a century later, producers of born collectibles were able to sell these dream worlds and fantasies to a large group of Americans. And maybe you're among them, or maybe you know people who are, who were encouraged along with the help of marketing departments of the Franklin Mint, Precious Moments, Tie Inc., and others. When collectors sought to liquidate their assets to at last realize the economic value of their often vast collections, they came face to face with these inherent contradictions, finally understanding that despite themselves and all they had bought into, the precise limits of the sentimental and the social value when it came to the cold, hard marketplace of cash. Thank you. Sure. No, that was probably a lot. I'm happy to take any questions you might have or open it up for discussion.
I have maybe a little story to tell. I used to be
Great.
involved in, I used to be involved in the gift market.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, I was selling, I personally was selling, I think it was, it was legitimate product. It was hand blown glass ornaments. like
Mhm.
Christmas
Yeah.
But I started with the Atlantic City gift show, which was small,
Yep.
but then I went to the New York gift show,
Mhm.
which is like 4 floors. It's in the Javits Center.
Yeah.
And if you can imagine, just it's like it's a huge marketplace. And I'm there from the beginning to the end, like during setup, just the amount of product in this place. I remember an Esco.
Mhm.
That was like a really big, they had many booths, like they had
Yeah.
almost like a quarter of a floor. And people thronged to this place. It was really popular.
They were a
This
big
was in the
deal.
80s.
Yeah. Yep.
And it was like a world that I had, never known.
Yeah. Pretty
And,
eye-opening.
So it was a strange world.
Yeah. Yeah, I write about those gift shows in my book.
Have you visited
a-
them?
I haven't. I would love to. They sound
Yeah.
like they're just kind of bananas. Yeah.
I remember there was a George Little company. They were the management company. But I'll just say, I ended up, I wasn't making any money with this. So I could rent out my space because I was renting, I forget how much I paid for these booths. I had 2, but I would rent it out to other companies. I would get to know sales reps. And
Yeah.
I said, yeah, I got this line of product. And I remember I didn't even show my product. I just rented it out
That's
to,
smart.
I think it was called Victoria Enex or something. It was like dolls made somewhere. And everybody around me, because a lot of people are really selling, legitimately made, like
Yes.
handmade
Yes.
product. Anyhow, I angered a lot of my neighbors by having this crappy line of dolls that I had rented out.
Oh, right.
I was-
Right. You were tarnishing their brands through association.
So I
Yeah,
gotta-
that's funny. Thank you. Yeah.
I was gonna say, when my son was younger, we used to buy these, Hess trucks.
Yep.
For Christmas time. They keep pushing it every year.
Yep.
Different model.
Collectible.
And
Yep.
then some of my friends would be buying them for their young ones, and you gotta keep that in the box.
Box.
You gotta hang on to that, like for investment
Yeah.
purposes. But we didn't have that idea of why we bought that.
Yeah.
People, they wanna hang on to it for like an investment. That's not really if everybody's doing the same thing, what good is it?
Exactly, exactly. See, you could have given my talk in like 20 seconds, because that's the whole point. Like, these things are mass produced. You should play with them. You should use them as they're intended, but you're right. People get this idea that they're limited, but if they're produced in these factories, they're not rare. And so the value probably won't appreciate. Yeah.
My grandson got 2 Hess trucks every year, one to play with and one to save in the farm.
Okay, good.
And secondly, does anybody want to buy in Boyd's Bears?
Boyd's Bears. That's another one. Yeah, yeah. And again, don't get me wrong, like I understand. I mean, you should see my house. I've got tons of stuff. So I understand that people, we build emotional connections to things. And so if you love your Boyd's Bears, Godspeed. That's great. That's great. But it's when you've been deceived that those things are going to appreciate in value, even if there's a bubble, which we saw for Hummels, especially, a little less so for Precious Moments, but Beanie Babies, certainly. So for a time, if you get in and if you sell at the right time, which is, like, that's one of the rules of the market, then yeah, you can make money. But ultimately, yeah, these things are not durable investments, and people think they are. Yeah.
I say all the time that all my stuff, my son will have in the front yard for a nickel.
Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
Oh, my mom, when I was really young, my parents got me the Gone with the Wind Barbie collection.
Yeah.
They're in the gold box that you pop open and like you can see them. And I was always told those are collectible Barbies, you don't open them.
Yeah.
And then I still have them. And then a couple of years ago, I was just curious. We had an accession guy come in and like look at, people could come in and he'd value it. And he's like, oh, they're like $30
Yeah.
together. But like they have sentimental values, but I
Sure.
always thought that was
Sure.
funny that.
Yeah.
Like, I always thought they'd be worth a lot
Yeah.
more.
And again, like some of the Barbies are, and you can find that out by going to eBay and seeing like how many are out there, what's the going price. And again, that's like erasing what academics call information asymmetries. So all of a sudden it's sort of like buying a car too now. Like you can go online and see, so you don't have to rely on the dealer to kind of, wheel and deal you and tell you what, this is a great deal. Well, I can see, I can do my research by going online. So it's the same. Yeah, it's the same thing.
Yeah, no problem. Well, thank you so much.
Well,
for
thank
coming.
you. This has been a real treat. Yeah. Go out and enjoy the day. Thanks, Brittany.
Thank you so much.